Thank you for taking some extra time in your afternoon on this very significant weekend and powerful day to be here for this conversation. Was that a powerful movie or what? Man, my goodness. So much to say. So we have, my name is Julian Newman, and I'm a part of a local church here called Tribe Church, as well as I do work in the area of diversity and inclusion with a company called Culture Creative. And we have some extraordinary panelists that are with us today that are going to lend their perspective and their expertise to this conversation today. So we have 2 mics, and then we have a series of questions, and then we're just going to jump right into this. And if we have some time near the end, maybe we can open it up to you. So our first question that I would like us to get to, and when you answer it, if you could just introduce yourself to the crowd here. But this movie, we all come in with our preconceived notions of what a film like this is going to be, or for those of you that may have read the book. But what are some things that surprised you about this film that maybe caught you off guard that you didn't necessarily expect you to feel or see or think or come to know? Who wants to be our first panelist that speaks? Well, you have the microphone. You can go ahead and talk.
I guess I have the microphone, so I can start. I'm Christina Elmore. I'm a circuit court judge here in Kent County. And so I don't think that anything about the film really surprised me, and I think that's because I think I shared several perspectives that were within the film. One was, of course, the judge. It's like, okay, everybody order. You have to maintain this decorum within the courtroom. Also, as a Black woman, I had a perspective from the community members that I shared, as well as the attorney who was in the film, that a lot of the things that he said, I was like, I've said that before, or I share that same sentiment. And so, but I wasn't really surprised by anything that I saw in the film.
Thank you, Judge Elmore. Someone else? Yeah, what?
You want to just go down the line?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So I'm Holly Honig. I'm the Vice President for Humanity for Prisoners. We're a Michigan-based nonprofit that does advocacy and support, personalized service, problem-solving, non-legal stuff for folks who are incarcerated in the state of Michigan. And I think to answer the question, kind of same thing. It was less surprising and more, I'd say, reinforcing about why I do the work that I do and why I think it's important to do the work that I do. I had read the book, and I think the movie in particular, because more folks go to movies than they do read books, I think it's a brilliant way to maybe open some space for people who don't know about the realities that many of our communities face and the way that we over-police and over-surveil and over-criminalize communities of color in particular. So maybe it'll open some room for people to see that happening and understand how imperative it is. That I particularly liked the last scene in the movie because it's really sort of a call to action, you know, that we all need to get involved and do something about it.
Good afternoon. I'm Senita Lenear, and I have the privilege of serving as the 3rd Ward Commissioner for the City of Grand Rapids. And what surprised me, I guess I make it a practice to not necessarily research movies that I'm planning to watch. So I really didn't know what to expect. I know it was about a case and an attorney, and that was because I heard him on NPR interviewing a couple weeks ago. But I didn't really know what to expect. But I will say that what was challenging for me personally was to watch the last mile execution scene. That was very challenging for me. I think another thing that was challenging was to see someone trying to create justice in an unjust world or in an unjust space, and just watching him feeling alone and being able to kind of relate to that when you're vocal about issues of injustice in spaces, and you may travel that road sometimes alone, and it's challenging because even in a moment where he felt defeated, actually the defeat ended up being a blessing. So for the case to then go to the state, it changed the trajectory, in my opinion, of what the outcome could have been, because had there been a retrial at the local level, it was clear that they could not police themselves, that they weren't going to do right, just the system in general, locally. And so that defeat ended up being a blessing, and he had to be encouraged then by Mr. McMillan, the attorney did, so that he can have the encouragement in order to do more. And so those were just some elements about challenges and what I expected.
Hello, my name is Alex, and I'm a senior at Forest Hill Central High School. And I also didn't know what to expect coming into this movie, but I guess what challenged me and what stuck with me is when Walter said how he was guilty from the day he was born, and just like really accepting that, and that was a reality, and kind of sort of is now still.
I'm Mary Alice Williams. Have been involved in various aspects of promoting social justice in our community for a long time. I guess in terms of what surprised me was how compelling this movie made the complexities of society thinking that the criminal justice system can, on the basis of one crime, condemn someone to death. At the end, he talks about unmerited grace. And I think this made as clear as anything has to me in a long time that all of us are in need of unmerited grace and that we're not defined by one action. Even Herbie, the man who acknowledged that he had committed the crime. That scene reminded me so much of a recent scene in Grand Rapids where a young veteran who was a citizen of the United States was detained not by the officer at the scene, but because some officer in his home the night before Thanksgiving profiled him based on race and assumed he was a terrorist, where really he was a veteran suffering from PTSD. And I think that we will not have social justice until we are able to address the complexity in every issue, as opposed to just saying guilty means that you are that and defined by that forever.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeshua Lauka. I'm an attorney in Grand Rapids. Wow. I think what, for me particularly, Judge Elmore talked about relating to Bryan, and I read the book, and I think the thing I was most surprised about, I'm not a big crier, and reading that book, I did not cry, but watching that movie, I cried. Thank you. It's one of those themes that if you've read anything about Bryan or watched any other videos, he talks about being into proximity to people who are vulnerable. And that became so obvious in those relationships he had with people in dire situations. It's just, we can talk about things in the abstract, but when we're in a relationship with people, that's where change happens. Anyway, thank you.
I concur. My name is Michael Daniels. I direct a nonprofit called School to Career Progressions, or Ingenium. One of the basics of the movie that I got was it takes relationship for justice, and it's a high price for justice. That if one person is mistreated, that's an injustice for the rest of us in the future. And if one people is treated right, that's the justice for all of us in the future.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. So I would like to ask, Bryan Stevenson says the opposite of poverty is justice. And so the movie really concludes with that idea, and that's prominent in his book. What role does poverty play in this story? Anyone who wants to, you just go ahead.
Okay. Walter was limited to the resources because he was in poverty. So he said that like when the money ran out, so did the lawyer that he had. So which means he didn't have access for them to fight for him or, get the resources for that.
Yeah, I agree with Alex, and I think, just resources and having access to, in his case, an attorney who was willing to fight for him. But I think for me, I did see the element of poverty and the role that it played, but I felt like racism overpowered even the poverty. It really just didn't matter about, whether people had resources or not. Racism was, to me, the key factor in sending these men to death row. And so I thought, I did see where poverty played a role, but I felt like racism was more prominent.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question. It makes me think of, connections between that different studies do between the evidence of poverty and crime and how that gets misused, I think, in terms of the way that people then make those connections sort of anecdotally or informally. I think it really does kind of go down to what you were saying in terms of access. If we can shift our frame of thinking around, individual motivation, like, being in poverty causes someone to engage in an underground economy or something to that effect, where we can think less about that and more about the access and the resources that are available to communities in terms of jobs, in terms of access to good education, in terms of, health and well-being and health care and mental health care. And, it's a really long list that I think that the connections are probably there that we need to start taking a look at more than the connection to crime or innocence and incarceration.
And one thing I just say, you guys can speak as you feel led to, okay? We'll just do this like we do it in the church. We're led by the Spirit. But one thing I will say is you were talking about the whole aspect of racism. Man, it's so key. And then the juxtaposition or the relationship with poverty and racism. So you talk about access. I don't have access, but part of the reason I don't have access is because of my racial, history. And there's one thing that at the end, when Bryan Stevenson was making the case, and he says this man was on death row for a year, and so his state was already his judgment, to so to speak, is already taken care of before we had the opportunity for him to be tried for judgment and justice. Anyone else want to speak to the issue of that? So, Judge, you have anything you'd like to say?
You mean the issue of poverty? Or what
Yeah.
So I believe that it's definitely true that people that are in poverty have less access to justice because they cannot afford adequate legal representation. And there are good attorneys that are public defenders, and there's also people that are not so good that are public defenders. And so people that have money can obviously pay attorneys, and people that don't can't. But not only that, people that are in poverty are more easily victimized by, as you saw in the film, by the police, by corrupt officials that decide that I'm going to make you the person that's going to pay for this crime. And you're more easily made a victim if you're in poverty and you don't have the ability to access justice. And I think that's known, and that was known by the law enforcement in the film, that, hey, we can pick on this person. Mr. Myers, was it the guy that testified against him? He was also in poverty. He wasn't black, but he was in poverty. He was victimized too. So I definitely think that while racism was a strong factor, that poverty absolutely impacts justice and is the opposite of it. I agree with Mr. Stevenson's idea in that.
I think that we talk about poverty, but we don't talk about the systemic roots of poverty. People become poor and stay in poverty because there are forces that want and need people to be poor. And then as it relates to the criminal justice system, I think that we look at poor people, and all of us, we may be kind to a poor person that we know, but we make judgments based on people, how people look, how people talk, where they live. And I think we don't stop to ask ourselves, how does it come that poor people go to poor schools, poor people have unreliable transportation, poor people do not have access to affordable housing, and all of those things create conditions in which people do what they have to do to survive. And sometimes that's against the law. But other people who do things that play with the law or break the law have the means to either be defended when that happens or to skirt around the law. And we all act as if the law is blind, and the law isn't blind. It's looking at poor people, in my experience.
Just briefly, the lack of access to justice that Judge Elmore was talking about, I mean, that's something that our state particularly has been aware of for a while. And I know that in the last 10 years or so, we have an Indigent Defense Commission it's a process in work. It's not my area of expertise, but I'm aware of it. Anything?
I think it's who defines what's justice. The more resources I have, the more I can define you. So if you have rich people defining justice is based on their economic value. Likewise, I think if you have poor. So if we want to talk about what justice is, I think it would have to be balanced on the poor people, the minorities, the majorities, and the rich people would have to determine what's right and what's not right. As our system is created, it's created that the rich people can make decisions. The decisions is to build a system to keep poor people down so we can stay rich. But I think it's past being black or white or whatever race you are. It's based on, I gotta have mine and I gotta make you lower so that I can keep mine. It's what level of sacrifice will I make to help my brother or sister? And will I take less so that it will be equal for everyone?
I think you guys can keep it on that side of the room for now. You know, one of the things I believe is we're talking about poverty, we're talking about justice, we're talking about race, and the role that it plays. These are all elements of a very complicated problem. And so I think sometimes we can see the world through a both. I mean, you know, it's either this or that, but sometimes it's this and that and this over here. And so there's a huge mix. And one thing I would like to add to the cocktail of complexity is mental illness. There's a very prominent character in the story, Herbert, that's a Vietnam veteran who has PTSD, has acknowledged his criminal behavior, but he's on death row and he needs help, and no one is really there to give him the help. So what role does mental illness play in this conversation in relation to justice and the opportunity to access for someone to advocate in relation to the criminal justice system? So on this side of the room, do you guys want to start? Does anybody feel like you want to start with that, Judge? Mental illness?
Sure. So I know that, well, in my experience, I deal a lot with people that have varying degrees of mental illness. And it is such a huge problem, especially with the fact that there aren't any state hospitals for people to be in. So oftentimes people who back in the day may have been in a state hospital and may have been able to be cared for in that way are left on the street. And then they're on the street and they're not employable, so they're homeless or they're poor or they engage in criminal behavior, like he was saying that he didn't mean to hurt anybody. So it's just such a huge issue and a huge problem. And there's, as I was saying, what I do is I do a lot of family court, so I do a lot of child abuse and neglect. People often neglect their children inadvertently because they suffer from a mental illness, which then goes down to the child, who then suffers trauma in their life, and then they have to be, because they suffer from trauma, they have mental illness, and then there's just, I can just go on and on, I'm sorry. But I just see that as a very huge issue, not only in the film, but just in our community.
Yeah, I would add too, I mean, I'm glad you brought up state hospitals, because we know, again, Humanity for Prisoners deals with people who are incarcerated already. And there's a very high percentage of our clients that are dealing, to your point, some degree of mental illness that isn't being addressed appropriately. And I mean, the point is, from prosecutors at the beginning of the system to the COs once you're there, the system isn't equipped to handle folks with mental illness. They're not trained properly. They're not paid properly to handle things like that. And we know, historically in the 80s, a lot of those state hospitals, we call them mental institutions in the 80s, they were closed for good reasons. They were horrible places. So it was not a bad thing that they closed, but there was no safety net. There was no alternate that was put into place for these folks. And so they ended up primarily homeless on the streets or in really dire circumstances in some form. And they were criminalized, even if they didn't break the law. There were, vagrancy laws and all kinds of different things that would, and they would end up in prison. And so it's a very real problem that needs to be addressed. I don't know what the right answer is. There's definitely a connection there, though.
I think you can tell a lot about what's important to people if you look at their checkbook. And I think this nation has done a poor job at addressing mental illness, especially with veterans. And we spend more money on the wars than we do in taking care of the people who we send over to fight them. And so, I think, so this gentleman, he's struggling with mental illness, and there are, no programs available, locally here now in Grand Rapids, in 2020. So definitely, I think that was the early 90s or late 80s, there probably weren't many programs that were addressing the issues of PTSD. And I think another thing that our country is prone to do is they redefine things when the people who are impacted by it, when they change colors. And so that's why you see a difference in how people are being treated now with the opioid addictions than what they were treated when there was crack cocaine. And so, suddenly we have programs, suddenly we are putting money and resources into helping people. And I think, both of those epidemics are epidemics that needed to be addressed, but we criminalize crack cocaine and place people in prisons and strip families apart from one another in this nation because of those addictions, which all were tied to mental illnesses as well, and people were using drugs to cope with some of the issues of poverty and other things we've already talked about. And I just think we're not doing well with mental illness, and I think it's going to take the public speaking out on that regularly, because since this is Dr. King Day, injustice, to one person is, in my opinion, is injustice to all of us. And if we don't take shape and form to make sure that we're supporting those who are being treated unfairly, who aren't getting the resources that they need, then tomorrow it could be our issue or us. And so we have to come alongside, even if you don't have personal stories of mental illness in your family or in your neighborhood, you still need to come alongside so that we can fight these issues together. Alex?
I also agree. I feel as a society we need to educate ourselves on mental illness and talk about it boldly so that we can remove the stigma. And because in the movie, he shouldn't have been on death row. He should have been in a hospital being helped. So I feel that as a society we need to educate ourselves and talk about it.
I think Alex is absolutely right. And maybe instead of talking about mental illness, we ought to talk about mental health and understand that all of us need mental health just as we need physical health. We need access to care. We need to remove the stigma associated with those early signs. And I think the other part of the complexity of mental health is we are more and more beginning to understand the role that trauma plays, whether it's the children that are abused and neglected, or whether it's a father struggling to support his family and knowing no matter what he does, it isn't going to make it. All of that trauma has an impact on mental health. And I think the mental health systems in our community need to be ramped up. There was a time when actually mental health services in Kent County were halfway decent. That has eroded. It's eroded over a couple of gubernatorial sessions. And I think that we all have to say to our elected legislators. This is an important part of what makes us a whole community. And we have to reach out to one another. Lots of times it's relational and on a human level. Do we shun the person we know is struggling, or do we try, whether as individuals, as family members, as church members, to wrap ourselves around them and say, you're not alone in this, and we'll help you.
That last point particularly resonates with me. One thing in the movie that was very, very poignant when Herbert talked about how he didn't have any friends. And well, we're all your friends, Herbert. I can guarantee you it was also in the book. Herbert burned through whatever relationships he had because of his mental illness. For the last 10 years or so, I spent a lot of time giving my time to rescue mission work. And one thing at Mel Trotter Ministries, where I serve, we talk about that people end up homeless usually by a lack of relationships, by a lack of community. And we really do need to, particularly with people who are hard, who burn through those relationships, be that community.
So with mental health, I think it starts with family. And if each of us would help one person that's in your family that's struggling, and that person would help another, I think we would have a better, healthy development for all people.
So there's, you spoke about something that generations or the legacy of. So if we have a family that's struggling or is in a criminal circumstance, a lot of times that gets passed on to the next generation. And then we have this whole legacy of dysfunction that plays itself out over the course of time. The movie talks about legacy in a very unique way, in the sense that they're very proud of the fact that, Harper Collins is here and To Kill a Mockingbird. And there's this real interesting paradox that as they're proud of this iconic story, they at the same time are perpetuating the truths that are illustrated in the story. And so, hey, let me tell you about this, and you go to the museum, but we're actually doing the stuff that was in the book. And that paradox is something that we don't just see in the movie, but we're living it. We're living in a country that says all people are equal, but here we are having a conversation of the inequality when it comes to the access to justice. So would some of you speak to the irony that we see in the story, and maybe even speak to the paradox that we see in our culture on a day-to-day basis, where we believe one thing conceptually, but operationally we manifest into a different way? Okay, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, beginning with the secretary who didn't know Atticus Finch wasn't a real person, when she said, you can stand in the very courtroom where Atticus Finch stayed. I think, to me, especially, on this day, the morality lesson of the people in that town, Monroeville, being so proud that Harper Lee's book was written there, that could be an accusation that I'll point at myself, that we can maybe all point at one another. It's really not enough to just commemorate Martin Luther King Day, unless every day we do something. And that usually will involve pissing somebody off or some system off, because when you're working for justice, the movie shows it, you are not going to be the person invited to the best parties. But all of us have to come, commemorate, ritualize, but then say, what do we need to do? Whether it's in the criminal justice system, whether it's in housing, pick an issue. God knows there's enough of them. But to just be proud of the fact that we celebrate Martin Luther King Day is like being proud of the fact that Harper Lee was here. It doesn't cut it.
It's such an interesting question, though. How does that irony, how does it coexist? How does that disconnect? And what strikes me is just, the fear that was propagated throughout that, but then also just the fact that people I'll be honest, people like to be around people that are like them, that they're comfortable with, that they feel safe around. They don't like to get out of their comfort zone. That's a problem. That's something that we need to continually to press.
we often like the ideal of idolizing a concept. Like Martin Luther King Day, very important day. But if you ain't got any black friends, it kind of don't work. Or I would be a millionaire and I would put my name on a building, but I haven't helped one poor people. I think you have to be careful not to idolize the concept, but to serve people. And when you serve people, the whole community would increase. Otherwise, it's nothing different than my white Christian friends say, I love black people, and then you talk about black people in front of me and forget I'm black. It's the concept. You want to do right, but if it costs you something, you ain't willing to pay that price, because being status quo has its convenience, and building a system that keeps people down does pay off financially. But we're here because we are different people. It's about helping your neighbor, whether they're rich or not rich. It's about you sacrificing your convenience for the betterment of the whole community.
Wow, that was a lot. So I also believe, I want to talk about relationships that people have with each other and how that kind of wraps in with the irony in the film. I think oftentimes as people, we do feel more comfortable around people that are like us, that whether they look like us or they come from where we come from, we kind of gravitate towards people we can relate to. And I think it's so important for people to learn how to relate to people that are not like them. And if we keep staying in our own neighborhoods and staying in our own communities and not wanting to go to this area of town or this church or whatever, or not having conversations with people because maybe they don't look as friendly as you think they should look. I just think it's so important that people have relationships with people that are not like them, and until we're able to do that, we're all gonna stay in our little vacuums. And some of us, I feel personally, in the course of my life and career, I have had, I wanna say, the opportunity and not really a choice in relating to people that don't look like me, that maybe come from a background that I didn't come from, but I have to learn to relate. I have to learn to work with them, to live around them, to be around them. And the more you do that, the more you find that you have in common with people that didn't come from where you come from. But if you never do that, you're gonna think, oh, those people over there, oh, they're racist, or those people over there, they're animals over there. You're gonna keep doing that if you never open up, get out from where you are, go talk to people, go get to know people, because people are just people.
So the question, you called it ironic, right, the situation, and I think that's a little bit diplomatic, to be honest. I think it's just downright hypocrisy, you know? And I think it's all of the things that you asked about. It's indifference, it's naivete, it's sometimes willful, it's sometimes unconscious. I think that there's also an element, like speaking as a white person, part of the privilege that a white person has is to be able to say, like, not my problem, and tomorrow's probably gonna be just fine. Like, I can ignore it, whatever that problem is. If it's communities of color, being oppressed or over-surveilled or whatever it is, if it's children in detention centers, I can probably watch that on the news and then watch my Family Feud and forget about it, and my life will be okay tomorrow. So I think part of that hypocrisy is, we need to hold space for not being okay with that, as people who have that privilege to be able to say, not my problem. It is our problem, right? Our liberation, our freedom, our communities, we're all bound up together, and we need to start getting smart about that and doing something.
I like hypocrisy, too. Dr. King has a quote, and he talks about the two Americas. And so we really do have two Americas. We have two Grand Rapidses as well. And so, we have spaces where people can navigate through this community. As a matter of fact, I'll just give a quote from an African American who had moved to Grand Rapids, and I ran into this person, someone introduced me to them, and, we got quiet in a corner. They were like, where are all the black people? And I was like, you haven't experienced black people. And so what happened is they were whisked away into, Ada, to find their home. They, built their home there, and he was navigating his world from work to home, and everything in between didn't look like him. And so we have, these situations where it's easy for someone to be naive to what's going on around them because they can navigate through life without having to deal with the pressures of what's happening with other communities. This is why we have such a strong program-rich community, but impact-poor. So, there's a lot of programming going around. It's a lot of talk about what we need to do. It's a lot of money being raised to do it. But somehow, some way, the impact that we're saying we all want isn't happening. And really, it comes down to power. So if you don't relinquish your power to the people who you want to make a difference with, then guess what? The difference will never be made because you still hold the power in order to not make that difference. Give people the tools, give them the access, give them the authority, and you will suddenly see America becoming one America, or Grand Rapids becoming one Grand Rapids, because what you'll see when people who haven't been in power get the power, you'll see the outcomes that we all say we want, because the people, I know what I want, and so give me the power to be able to create that, and that's how we all feel, and I think that's part of the issues that we've seen in this movie and the issues that we may experience day to day.
I think everybody said something really great up here, and I'm just going to agree with them because it got kind of deep.
Yes.
We are sensing that the audience wants to begin to ask some questions.
Okay. All right, come on, audience. Let's get in here.
And or comments.
Okay, all right. If you can just keep your comments, if you have a comment, keep it concise. If you have a question, we would love to hear from you. So, yes, I see right here. No, just talk loud, man. If
I can bring it to him. I'm right
okay.
here.
Oh, all right.
Some of the characters in the movie, especially like the DA, the sheriff, the original judge, I didn't see as much hate in those characters as I saw maybe just delusion or ignorance. And I'm wondering why, when you have people in those positions of power, why was the community almost encouraging them to maintain their ignorance?
Yes, please.
So the interesting part about that comment is that hate takes different forms. And so silence is a form of hate when there's injustice happening in front of you. And I actually think, so they may not have had torches, or they may not have been putting crosses in people's yards and burning them, and they may not have been wearing hoods, but their actions and their lack of, they knew the law, they were attorneys. So they had access to the same information that Bryan had access to, but they chose not to do that. That's hate. And I think that's the challenge that we're faced with all the time, is because when people don't look like this as they're saying negative things or doing negative things or having negative behaviors, then we don't see them as being hateful or racist. It's still racism and it's still hate.
I have another response as well. I think that a lot of it was ignorance as well, because I think about how things happen now and how things happen in the court system now, and not just from the film, but I think oftentimes, and in the film, I think they really, really thought that that man killed that woman. And whether or not it wasn't a fair, they don't care. They think he really did it, meaning the community members that were sitting there, because they weren't probably privy to what happened in the trial. They don't know. The attorneys know. That attorney, the prosecutor, I wasn't the prosecutor on the case. So they all believed, I think, that that man really did it. And so whatever they had to do to maintain, because I don't believe they want the real killer to be free. I think they really thought he did it. And whatever they had to do to make sure he went down for it, they did. So I don't know, I know that hate's involved, I know racism's involved, but I do think a lot of ignorance takes place in the system. And that's what it looks like. Like, well, they really believe that the person that went down for it is guilty, so.
Absolutely.
I guess I respectfully disagree. I think that I think clinging to your ignorance is a gift of privilege. And I think in that context, just what we know about that context, they needed someone to be guilty. They weren't good at their jobs. They couldn't find who did it. And so they picked the closest black person they could find, and they made him guilty. And once you've got that scenario, the story is written, and you then have to justify the story that you've created. I think ignorance is not an excuse in the law. I think that ignorance is something that we do to make people feel, I didn't know. Well, somewhere deep down inside you do know. And I think these people, and the other part of it to me is it goes back to we're such good people that we don't want to believe any individual is evil. I don't think we have to decide whether anybody is evil. If the system isn't working, and if the system is skewed against a group of people, poor people, people of color, sometimes women, LGBTQ people, when the system is skewed against you, it's the system we have to fix. I don't have to worry about whether you're a good person or a bad person. I have to worry about whether the system is working for everyone.
It's a comment up here, so I'm gonna let her go real quick, and then you can go.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to make reference to the discussion of poverty versus racism. If we look at the story, Walter had his own business, and when the cop approached him in his vehicle, what did he say? You driving around in this fancy car. So it wasn't as if Walter was extremely impoverished. The reason that they stopped him was because he had a quote-unquote relationship with a white woman. So that goes systemically back to racism. And if you think about how many black men have been lynched, killed, murdered, burnt, and let us not forget about the destruction of Black Wall Street, that was Tulsa, Oklahoma, because of the words of a white woman against a black man. That is nothing else but systemic evil racism, and that was the genesis of this story.
Would you please give a round of applause to this great panel that we had? And I want to thank you for coming and for spending some time here watching this movie and having dialogue and having an opportunity to discuss this as a community. And so at this point, we are adjourned. Make sure that you get, if you parked in the studio park, that you get your ticket validated, or you're gonna have to pay. So make sure you have that done. Thank you so much for coming.